My name is Emily Tector. I'm the project coordinator with a grant project called Situating Science. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to part 3 of our Science and its Publics lecture series with the Situating Science cluster and also the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs. The title for tonight is Provenance and the Role of the Public Museum, How the Life Stories of Artifacts Challenge Traditional Accounts of Science and History by David Pantaloni. I want to first I'll run down the agenda a little bit here, and also thank the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, Situating Science. We partnered with the Maritime Museum, who have this great space for this talk, and the Nova Scotian Institute for Science.
My name is Sheila Brown, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, which is very pleased and proud to be one of the co-sponsors and co-organizers of this evening's presentation. So in the spirit of advertising, since many of you are perhaps not familiar with CCEPA, I'll just take 2 minutes to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We are a joint initiative of the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University, and our mission is to provide a public forum where people can come together to look at topics through an ethical lens, to engage in critical thinking, in discussion and research about the various ethical challenges that we confront in our society. And we fulfill that mandate by sponsoring and co-sponsoring public presentations like this one. We also have a program of research fellowships, and we also work with various organizations who are interested in building ethics more explicitly into their objectives and their plans. So on behalf of our board, which is chaired by Alan Shaw, and all our board members, our general manager, Chris Stover, and myself, I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of CCEPA to the special presentation this evening by David Pantaloni. The series is made possible by the collaboration we have with the Situating Science Knowledge Cluster that you've heard briefly about. This is a federally funded by one of the granting councils cluster. It's a 7-year project to promote new ways of bringing together scholars studying science and technology and connecting with the public. So I'm delighted to see, because of our broad collaboration this evening, so many of you from a variety of walks of life, and that helps us feel that we are meeting our objective of reaching out to a public audience. If your appetite is whetted by tonight's talk, you can also access previous presentations in the Science and its Public series on the CCEPA website, www.ccepa.ca, and this tonight's talk will also be loaded up. It is being live streamed as well, and the subsequent presentations, which will take place in Western Canada, since we do offer our programs across the country, will also be accessible through our website. So I encourage you to do that. And there's also some additional materials on the back table, some DVDs of previous presentations which may be of interest to some of you, and you are most welcome to help yourself. There is no charge. There's a special promotion this evening. So now I'm pleased to hand things over to Professor Melanie Frappier of the University of King's College, who will introduce our guest this evening. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the evening. Melanie.
I don't have any advertisement. Like most people, I know, well, at least in Canada, I know how to read words. But I spent most of my adult life not knowing that you can also read artifacts. And the 3 people who taught me that actually are the ones who you're going to hear tonight. Our main speaker is Dr. David Pantaloni. He has a PhD from the University of Toronto, but then he traveled quite a lot. He had held a postdoctoral position at Dartmouth College, which hails one of the most important collection of scientific instruments in North America. He then was a curator at the Bakken Museum in Minneapolis, and he is now the curator of the physical and medical collection at the Canada Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa, and he also has a position at the University of Ottawa. I met David Pantaloni when I more or less ended up by mistake at what would turn out to be the most fantastic summer school I've ever attended, Reading Artifact, which is now held annually at the Canada Science and Technology Museum. They take people from all walks of life, whether they're students or academics or professionals, bring them together in the warehouse of the museum and teach them how to look at artifacts past their functions, to find meaning, to find values, to ask the questions that we never ask when we look at instruments. And you'll have a feel of what that is like in tonight's talk. While I was there as a student, there was another student who actually taught me how to look at instruments, and that person is Robert Bean. Robert studied at NASCAD just to come back to it as a professor later on, where he teaches now photography. His work has been exposed all around the world, all over North America, in New Zealand, in South America, in Europe, and he has also published widely on photography and the arts and art and cultural history. And he has been the recipient of major research and creation grants, one, among other things, on the obsolescence and the culture of human invention, which he's wrapping up. And you'll probably, at this workshop I was telling you about, he was kind of one of the students, but at the end, when all of the students presented their work, that's where the revelation happened. He was working with a very old computer from the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. And until then, I mean, I have a degree in engineering. I thought I understood computers. Until the lights went down and three voices started talking on pictures of the computers that were going in front of us. And I swear this is when I understood what a computer really was and what it really meant to people using it. And the third person who actually taught me how to look at things is Ted Kavanagh, who used to be an award-winning architect in Vancouver and decided, I really don't know why, to let all this glory behind him and teach at Dalhousie, getting also in the meantime a doctorate in history of technology. His research is all about the development of building techniques and the communication of building techniques within communities. He has taught and lectured at over 30 universities and worldwide organizations like the UNESCO. He has received, of course, major grants for combining culture and community with building and technology. And if you are ever in Chitika, you can admire his work, because he is the one who with his students built that wonderful children's theater they have there, and who won this national prize, right, for a community-based project in 2005. So please join me in welcoming our three speakers.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And thank you to the partners for inviting me here tonight, Situating Science Cluster, the Nova Scotian Institute of Science, the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, And thank you for the responders for reading my talk and preparing responses, which I'm looking forward to. And Emily Tector for organizing this great event. And of course, I'm so pleased to be at this beautiful museum, the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, for the first time, actually my first time in Halifax. Tomorrow, I hope to squeeze in a visit to Pier 21, where my Italian family began its Canadian journey here 99 years ago when my grandmother came from Sicily. And tonight, I am talking about journeys of artifacts, no less dramatic than the journey of my grandmother, and what tracing those journeys tells us about science and how we learn about not only science, but how we communicate science to the public through looking at those journeys. So I want to start, first of all, I want to start with one of my favorite quotes from John Steinbeck's book, Travels with Charlie, because I think it fits some of the journeys I'm going to be talking about. And he says at the beginning of that book, you don't take a trip takes you. And I think it's the same for anyone who's engaged seriously with artifact work. So here's a recent trip I was on to Saskatchewan, just to kind of take you across the country to another place. This is in the basement of the physics department with the chair of physics here, and he introduced me to, because this is what I do, I go around to various physics departments and basements around the country. I'm kind of the Indiana Jones of hospital basements and scientific departments. And he said, okay, we have this really important spectrograph that we think is connected to the Nobel Prize winner, Gerhard Hertzberg, who's really probably the most celebrated scientist Canada has produced, or not produced, and you'll see part of the story here I'm about to talk about. So I went down and looked at it, and of course I'm very interested in this story because we have a lot of Hertzberg artifacts in our museum at the Canada Science and Technology Museum. And but the provenance on it, the origins of it, were kind of not known, and Chari, the chair of physics, introduced it to me as basically something that might be related to Hertzberg, but that they were going to put on display to demonstrate the principles of spectroscopy. I was very intrigued. My antennae went up. I immediately thought, oh, I'm always skeptical. I see this in collections all over, the iconic artifact that is related to some heroic figure in the department's past. And so I researched the heck out of it. I took measurements and was furiously that night in the hotel room trying to figure out if this was the one. The next morning, I went back to look at it more carefully and discovered something that no one had ever seen, and it's been sitting in the basement there for years. And it was this plaque. This is a very small plaque. This is like the size of a thumbnail on part of the precision part of this spectroscope, which was for, by the way, doing studies with light. This is actually a core part of the Hertzberg story. He came to Canada in 1935. He fled Nazi Germany because his wife was Jewish. She was a spectroscopist too. And he was forced to leave Darmstadt because they took his position away. And this was kind of his dowry. So he actually brought this to Canada, and this is the basis for spectroscopy in Canada. A major part of Canada is a kind of powerhouse in this field. And here was kind of the holy grail of that part of our history. And so right away, my whole thinking of this artifact was obviously quite realigned. So what I want to talk about here is just briefly as an example of provenance, or the origins of artifacts, and how it creates new meaning for the public, for historians, and for scientists here. So one of the things here that really stands out is that once you start piecing together the history of this artifact, and suddenly it came full throttle to us when we realized this, was that this artifact is not just about spectroscopy. It's about a lot more. And when you trace its journey, that's what comes out. So this is about Darmstadt. This is about fleeing Nazi Germany, and one of the world premier scientists having to flee Nazi Germany in 1935. It's about Saskatoon, the only university that would take him at that time. It's about the instrument makers in Saskatoon who were actually surprisingly very highly skilled. So there's all these kind of, and were kind of a foundation for his work at that time. So there's all these really surprising narratives that come about from researching this artifact. Instruments, another lesson that comes out of this is how scientists, their kind of instinct for looking at objects like this and how they display them. And what's really interesting, I've seen a lot of these types of artifacts in collections and museums, and they usually treat them as archetypes, so as general types, a spectroscope. So something that measured light, not something that was at a particular place at a particular time used by these people. And that's actually where the history comes into it. So that's a kind of a tradition within the sciences, and I think why the topic tonight in particular resonates with, or is very important for the sciences, because I think in the sciences there has been no real discussions about these types of issues. It's strange because I'm only going to touch on it briefly right here, but the traditions in the art world and in the kind of mainstream museum world are drastically different. So for example, provenance is very serious in the art world where there's Nazi provenance, and that is a big issue internationally right now, and it has been for years, where they're tracing the origins of the objects, and this is high stakes, serious legal people involved, networks around the world of researchers, and really, really top-notch researchers doing fine-grained analysis of artwork and museum pieces from that period. Also, repatriation, a big issue in Canada in a lot of museums with artifacts that are being claimed by Native groups or by other communities across the country. And I've been involved in those types of discussions at other museums, and it is very emotional, but again, really serious research. And one thing that comes out of it are the practical things. Something's repatriated, and they prove ownership through documentation. But from my perspective, what I always love about these studies are the stories that come out of them and the meaning that come out of them. So if you see an artwork that has been, a piece of artwork that's been traced through Nazi provenance, just as an object, it's incredible the places it's been and the things it's witnessed. And that's what I really love, and that's what I'm going to talk about a bit tonight. So again, why does science resist this type of thing? There really isn't this tradition in science museums that there is in the other museums, and I think it really speaks to science is, I think it's like it's a fortress like no other that guards its myths and its heroic narratives, and I think you see that time and again. The spectroscope was one example. I think it turned out for the better. But I think there's a fear within curators and scientists of it turning out to be the mundane spectroscope and not the one. And what I always find is the truth is always more interesting. Or the truth can be quite uncomfortable, and I think this is another thing I wanted to introduce to you about provenance and the discomfort that it can raise and the fear around looking too closely into something. So here is a classic example from our collection. This is an MRI machine from the Montreal Neurological Institute. I inherited this in the collection. I got there 4 years ago, and this came to us before that. But it was in our records and had been given to us as the first MRI machine in the country from the early 80s. And so I just wanted to verify the date, and I did a simple dating thing. I didn't even mean to go into provenance work on it. And it turned out that it wasn't. It was actually from 1993. But in that, and we get that all the time. We get people giving us things because everyone is very interested in being the first, and it's pride, institutional pride, and it's not necessarily that they haven't looked into it, or it's just what happens. It's part of the traditions in medicine and science. But in dating it, this is a 20-ton object. It is very complex. It is late post-war, 20th century, medical technology, tons of components, and it was not a simple matter to date, even though it's in the last 30 years. And I actually got drawn into some very ornate kind of discussions, elaborate discussions with engineers in companies around the world and into the whole supply chain of some of the components here in order to date it. And one of the things that really came out that kind of struck me was the core of this machine here is a superconducting magnet. And at one point I asked one of the engineers, by the way, this niobium, this exotic niobium titanium wire in this magnet here, how long was the wire? And I didn't get a response for a while, and I think it was like they thought I was an Al-Qaeda operative or something. But the response was 36.9 kilometers of that. And what ensued was tracing the supply chain of the niobium. And the niobium took me to a mine in Brazil where there were environmental issues, labor issues, miners being exposed, and it's still today, niobium mining, it's associated with the release of radon, radioactive materials. And so this was really interesting. And then when I looked at each node of the supply chain, controversy appeared. So the processing of it, radioactive sludge. And then also, every time you look at a node, it explodes and there's no certainty within it. So some of the niobium was coming from the Congo, blood minerals. And because of the high demand for niobium these days, it's used in the Hadron Super Collider, for example, 500 metric tons. Oka has now become, in Canada, in Quebec, has become a major mine that they're trying to reopen with the same issues, radon in people's water. And so it's definitely I was suddenly drawn into all these kind of controversial ethical situations related to something very everyday for us. So not only did I dismantle a myth, it was the first, I put a very common healthcare icon in Canada in an unfavorable light. And that was kind of, that was interesting, a surprise for me. There's an article coming out in Canadian Medical Association Journal that I published, that's about to be published, called The Cost of Living, related to this. Just to get another twist here on the ethical dimensions of collecting in museums and science, we're planning a medical exhibit now at the Canada Science and Technology Museum, and I have been looking into getting a Body Worlds body. Some of you may have seen the Body Worlds exhibit that's toured North America and was open 24/7 in all places where it was a sensational success. I want to collect it and put it in our exhibit as an example of something that was a major part of the Canadian experience during the late 90s and the 2000s. A lot of people saw this show, so as a cultural artifact. But I've been looking into the provenance, and it's as some of you may know, there's some serious problems of knowing about the origins of these. Gunther von Hagen, this unusual character who's behind this whole thing, has a factory in China, and they're really, when you look at it really carefully, it's hard to know the origins of some of these, whether they're I think they've cleared up whether some of them are Chinese criminals, but then there's a whole issue of people actually donating their bodies, selling their bodies, the body trade. And so there's a lot of issues related to this. I'm looking into it because I'm still determined to get this for the museum because I think it's an interesting artifact. But there's a lot of pitfalls that I'm worried about. And I think this example really is a caricature of a lot of the provenance examples in science and medicine, because when you go to the Body Worlds exhibit, the provenance of these people, for privacy reasons and for von Hagen's own kind of amplifying his reputation reason, the provenance is quite suppressed. And that's interesting too, because I think that's the most interesting thing, is who these people were. So tonight I want to really look I've just introduced, given you an introduction to some of the issues, but I'm really going to talk about one particular artifact that I've been doing a lot of work on, and the lessons you can get from it. And so in a way, this is a journey into this artifact and its history in post-war Canada, but also as an example of provenance, the origins of an object, and also using the object itself as the evidence. So what is this? This is a cobalt bomb, it was called, in the early 50s and 1950s. This was a radiotherapy device used to treat cancer. So in that really bulky, heavy head there, you would have cobalt, and that was a gamma source that would basically knock out tumors. And this was a revolutionary cancer treatment developed in Canada in the early 1950s. So there's a really, in our museum, it's presented in the Innovation Canada exhibit. Because it was in 1951 when it was developed simultaneously in Saskatoon and in London, Ontario. It was international first, and it was an innovation. It's also couched in Canada's nuclear history in our museum because Canada was the second country to sustain a nuclear reaction in 1945 with the ZEEP nuclear reactor. The other way that it's presented in our museum is that Canada chose a peaceful path for the use of nuclear energy, or nuclear technology in this case. There's also a really fascinating commercial history. Atomic Energy Canada Limited was a major international player in the nuclear industry and the scientific industry and medical in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So this has a really interesting context, and it's presented that way in our museum and is very instructive about Canadian history in that period and our rich nuclear history. But what's interesting for me is that when you're actually on our floor, and I invite everyone here to come to Ottawa, and I'll give you a personal tour sometime, this artifact does not exactly fit the history that presents it. It really cries out for more attention, and it also, it doesn't fit this general history, this sleek, modern, beautiful machine there kind of cries out for more, what was it and where did this come from? And so I started looking into it as an artifact, and actually this 1950s artifact. One of the things that struck me first was the color. It doesn't come out there, but it's a really gorgeous hypnotic green. You look at it, and I would just stare at it for a while and get into a kind of Buddha trance looking at it. And it actually was the basis for an exhibit that I did at the museum on the color green in medicine. Medicine was green in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and so I brought all the green artifacts out of our medical collection and put them on display, and it was a really nice exploration of this cultural aspect of medicine that had been kind of forgotten, and you're only seeing vestiges of it these days. The other thing that was intriguing for me is the plate on it. There's a serial number on it. There's where it was made. And the story was actually quite local. It was made by Atomic Energy Canada Limited Commercial Products Division, which was a couple kilometers from our museum. And here it is. This is the actual factory that shipped these things around the world, literally. Canada had a massive presence around the world with these machines in the 50s and 60s, and this was the factory that's now for lease. When it closed down and moved out to a suburb of Ottawa in the 1960s, it was taken over by Public Works and then the Museum of Man at that time, which was we branched off from in 1967. So the irony of this is that at one time this was the storage, this was the factory where that was made, the Theratron, but then it was stored there too as a museum artifact. So I've since been there with actual people who work there, my students. We went there and interviewed some of the people that worked on engineers and technicians. And here's a picture of one of the guys we interviewed and a historic picture of the actual plant. So I'm really getting into this aspect of the provenance, where it was actually made, and bringing that to life, this very local part of the story. And really a few things that stood out from this activity was going through, and you see here a picture of the actual factory floor, the main factory floor, with the people who actually built these things. One thing that really stood out was the work that went into the shape and the style of the actual Theratron. So you see it's kind of a piece of sculpture almost. And it turns out it was one big rough casting, and then what this guy described it as, they bondoed the heck out of it. Bondo was a kind of industrial plaster, and they would almost sculpt it into this beautiful streamlined shape. And if you think that has kind of reminds you of manufacturing of cars, you're right, because Al here, for example, worked in Oshawa for a while. So there's a lot of kind of cross-fertilization between manufacturing industries at that time, and similar skills and values they're bringing to the factory. The other thing was painting, a giant area for painting. So they would coat these things with really heavy coats of that seafoam green paint, and they would buy tons of that seafoam green paint. That's what it was called, from CIL, and I have the exact number and the order kind of numbers for that. But the painting area was not just a small area. It was definitely a big part of this factory floor. The other thing that was really interesting, and you see the aluminum couch that the patients were lying on. You see these kind of decorative frostings on this. These, in the 19th century, were the signature of master machinists. And with AECL, it was more of a decorative feature that was expressing the pride of the machinists at that time. So this is a really interesting feature of the artifact, but it takes you into another whole dimension of the manufacturing of these, and that is these master machinists that they were recruiting in post-war Ottawa from England. So you had not only top engineers, top scientists coming from England, but you also had in the post-war these master machinists who were coming here. And here's kind of a simple expression of their pride in a signature aspect of the instruments. And here is, on display at that factory, the High Commissioner of India actually caressing that, nice aluminum couch there. These machines were always on display there for people like these dignitaries to come and look at them. And there's one of Roy Arrington, the head of the whole commercial products division, selling it to them. So, just to sum up that aspect of this story, what was really interesting is when I looked at actually on the factory floor. The making of these things, it realigned my whole thinking about what these objects were and how much time went into the painting and physical space went into these things, and the effort went into aesthetics and style. That's interesting. So suddenly I'm realigning my thinking on, okay, was this a cancer fighter, or was it something meant more for display? And that's where I'd like to introduce you to another aspect of this story. We're going to digress from the actual artifact, but look at more of what this aesthetic and style part was kind of fueling, or what it was feeding at this in the display context, the selling across the world, and the exhibiting of these atomic technologies. So one thing that the fairs that Atomic Energy Canada was involved in, the Atomic Fair in 1957 in New York, and all these world fairs and exhibitions, the one that really stood out for me, because I've looked at the photographs of them at the National Film Board still photography collection at the Contemporary Photography Museum in Ottawa. So the Seattle Fair in 1962 was a really major showcase for Canadian science and technology. And the Theatron was actually the star of that show. And that's really interesting, because Canada was presenting itself to the world as modern, progressive, scientific, technological. Other exhibits, like the Germans, had kind of a little beer hall, and they had a lot of folk type of presentation of themselves. France had things from the Louvre, but Canada was really presenting itself and branding itself as scientific and modern and fresh, and the Theatron was the star of that. So the aesthetics and style here are now on stage and important in literally constructing Canada's image at that period. And what you're looking at, I skipped this over, are the photographs that were done by the National Film Board of Canada Still Photography Division that went into these kind of foldouts for newspapers at the time. They were kind of propaganda, upbeat pieces about Canada at the time on various topics. And this was the one presenting Canada at the 1962 Seattle Fair. So there'd be hundreds of photos taken like this, and they would be selected and chosen for that photo story that would be in newspapers. Other things at the show were really presenting Canada as science and technology, like this rocket program, but for peaceful purposes. And there's some US soldiers looking at the rocket, wondering why they can't have rockets for peaceful purposes. So I want to take a little step back here and talk about, okay, now we're moving into the aesthetics, the style, branding, using this technology to brand Canada as modern and progressive and scientific. And what this is really doing is presenting us with an ideal at that time, and the Theratron was a major part of that. It wasn't peripheral. It was definitely a major part of advertising Canada at that time. And around the same time I was researching this, I was reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Cancer Ward. And this is a really interesting story that takes place in a remote part of the Soviet Union in the 1950s, same period as this. And one of the stars of that book, or the stars of that book, are of course, the patients, but also the X-ray therapy machines that are treating the cancer patients. And they're really presented in an interesting light. They're overworked. They're in need of constant maintenance that the people aren't necessarily up to. And these technologies are no match for the growing insidious cancers that inhabit the patients and, metaphorically, the Soviet Union at that time. But what I really think is interesting is that Solzhenitsyn's lesson there is not just about a rotting totalitarian state, but I think it's a commentary on medical technology too, and that is what we want it to be and what it actually is. And I think it's at this juncture where provenance and the real story of an artifact gets traction, and you really can see the kind of ideals here versus the reality of the actual technology. So let's look at the Theratron I've been showing you, which is actually serial number 15 produced in 1956 in Ottawa, and I've actually found the files for it because there's been a few successors to the Commercial Products Division, and I found the files in some dusty cabinets in the Canada warehouse where they actually are located now, and I was able to trace the story of this artifact, and it was in, as you can see here, Binghamton, New York. It was delivered there in January 1957, and to Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital. So you can see here the nuns and a kind of big fanfare in the local media, and on the right here is the bunker that was built to shield the cement shielding for the actual for the radiotherapy machine. So that was a big production just to get it there and build a special room for it. One other thing that came out of the local history of it in the archives, I've been in touch with them, are really interesting personal connections. And this, again, is part of the surprising element of looking in detail at the life history of an object. One of the people involved in getting it there was Congressman Sterling Cole, who was Congressman in New York at that time, but later that year actually became the first president of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So this guy was really connected in the world of nuclear technology, and he was Eisenhower's pick for the first president of that, and which was really an offshoot of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. So the Theratron was there for 13 years, from 1957 to 1970. And the service records in the files are really instructive about what this thing actually did. So there's a lot of repairs on the couches and the hydraulics, the shutters, the lights. For each of these stories, when I've interviewed the service guys, there are horror stories attached to them. So they're not trivial matters. So the hydraulics on the couch, there had been one very sensationalized story about the hydraulics failing on one Theratron and someone getting impaled by it rising up quickly. Shutters failing and someone being doused in radiation for longer than they should have. Lights failing, so not knowing when the shutter was, when the actual source was on or off. And so all these kind of stories, whether sensationalized or not, speak to the dangers and the wildly varying conditions in all these hospitals where Theratrons were placed around the world. 160 of these models were placed around the world, and I've been looking at those files and kind of doing a synthesis from all these microhistories of this object, of this particular model. What's really been interesting is not only talking to the service people looking at the records, but I actually talked to the technician at the hospital who worked on this from its arrival at the hospital. And she's in her late 80s and is very lucid, and we had a very good discussion about her memories of it and working on the Theratron Junior. Her name is Regina Bardish, and just to give you an idea, what was interesting, surprise again, provenance of this object, it worked basically on women for follow-up mastectomies. So I found that was interesting, knowing what it actually did and the kind of patients it worked on. There was a lot of concerns. She remembered concerns by staff and by patients about radiation. So this is, really only a decade after the atomic bomb. So when they saw that radiation sign on the door, there was uneasiness. And what was interesting to me is I asked her, what was on the aluminum couch? What did they lie on? And there was a special sponge with blankets that they lay on, and she said we had to replace them because people would sweat. So there was definitely physical nervousness being expressed, and I thought that was an interesting part of that. 4 to 5 weeks the treatments would last. They cost $250. No insurance at that time, so they would just pay the hospital. She remembers in particular one of the more emotional stories was a 5-year-old boy who had a brain tumor. And that was really interesting, her discussion of that, because it brought out they would have to be in this giant bunker-like room, and there was only one small lead-shielded window, and the mother and her were behind that. And there would be no microphone. The boy would sit there quietly, and he would be still for the few seconds that it would last, because they basically bribed him with match cars every time, and he was very pleased to come there and sit on this thing still for a few seconds so he could get his little match car. What was really interesting is the sound. Of course, there's no sound to gamma radiation, but what you would hear is the mechanical timer counting down the seconds and then zip, or there was a hiss, she said, to the actual shutters. So there's some really interesting sounds that were must have been experienced only by the patient, and I found that's very interesting to kind of explore those types of issues too. Here's the ideals of the room, and then Regina gave me what it was really like. What really stood out in the actual files when I was looking at them, in the final production files, the actual Theratron, this one, serial number 15, went through Milwaukee with a distribution agreement and was painted, as you can see there, GE gray. So suddenly I realized that this instrument that was green on our floor, that I had based a whole exhibit on, during its working life had been GE gray. And that was confirmed by Regina, who said it was gray with some black highlighting. But the room was green with green tiles, she mentioned to me. So, in conclusion, I want to go back to Solzhenitsyn's lesson about medical technology. I think the same applies for curators, what we want these objects to be and what they actually are. And I've learned so much from this type of lesson, sticking so closely to the artifact. And I tell my students, for example, to ride the artifact like a bronco. Do not fly off for fun historical trajectories, but stick to it and really stick closely to it, and surprises always appear, and a lot of lessons about history. I think in relation to this, provenance research, really fine-grained artifact analysis, I think there's a lot of change going on in the history of science right now. I think people are taking artifacts more seriously, and we're seeing this in teaching. Melanie hosted me today for a class, an artifact class at King's, and that was, that's the type of thing that I'm seeing a lot of right now, a lot of artifacts being introduced in research, and I think these are going to have really big implications for not only how scholars talk about the history of science, but how people in my position are presenting the history of science and science to the public. The other dimension of that we're really pleased with, and Melanie did do an advertisement for us on this, is the Summer Institute that we host at the museum, because really we're bringing people from across the country to engage with the collection, and then take those tools back to their respective regions and develop collections there. So I think we're seeing changes in exhibits and lectures. And one example I have, for example, is in Lisbon a few years ago, I organized a session at a conference in the history of science on these issues of going back to the source. So there was an artist from Norway who is doing work and has done an exhibit on what she calls the spar famine. Icelandic spar was a very particular crystal that was used, that came from Norway actually, and was used in a lot of polarizing microscopic instruments in the 19th century and early 20th century, to the point it was so popular that the source of it dried up, and there was a spar famine, this particular crystal, and she was retracing from around the world all the instruments that had this particular crystal in it, and my collection had some, and we gave her pictures of it, and she did a whole exhibition of these objects, and that was related to, I presented the niobium story, and someone from the Edinburgh, the National Museum of Scotland, presented a similar story about scientific instruments in Scotland. So I think that really that's the kind of thing that's coming out, a new way of looking at the history of science and objects, and really liberating us from traditional narratives in the history of science. And on that note, I give the floor to the responders, because Bob was our artist in residence in the fall, and we had a really good time engaging with the artifacts from totally new, radical perspectives. So thank you very much.
One of the things that I've had the pleasure of doing is working closely with David Pantalone over the last 2.5 years, beginning with a tour of the museum, which for any of you who have not been into the warehouses at the Canadian Science and Technology Museum, I would insist the next time you're in Ottawa that you call someone, and call David and have him give you a tour. It's truly overwhelming, it's astonishing. And it's not what you'll see in the museum floor. It's a different way of treating artifacts. It's a way in which things sometimes get stored haphazardly, in incongruous ways, and different types of narratives and relationships come out of the warehouse than what you might see on the museum floor. When I did come back to the museum, it was to do the Reading Artifacts symposium that Melanie spoke about earlier. And that really was an explosion of creativity. The research that I've been doing over the last 4 years has to do with the way in which obsolescence and technology follow us. And the way in which these technologies are not just out there somewhere, they're actually a part of our lives. They're embedded in our lives, they're embedded in everything we do. Get up tomorrow morning, try and live tomorrow without coming into contact with anything that has to do with technology. You cannot do it. We're embedded in it. It's embedded in us. It influences the kind of stories we tell, not only about technology and things, but about the world we live in and who we become through these technologies. So we developed different types of narratives. One of the things that David and I would do when I was artist in residence, we would go on what I would call a dérive. And for some of you who have come from the art world, you might know that dérive is a French word for drifting that was implemented by the Situationist International in France in the post-war period. They were a group of anarchists who would actually drift through urban spaces in a somewhat subversive way. and a way of undermining meaning in certain types of spaces. David and I would often get together and we would drift through the collection. And we would look for things. We would actually try to encounter objects and maybe even events that we hadn't anticipated, things that our knowledge wouldn't necessarily prepare us for, and the way in which things were juxtaposed. So I have some slides to show you today, but we're not going to be able to access them. So I'm actually going to describe a few just to give you a sense of what this might mean. In one area, sometimes artifacts are always being moved around in the museum. So we would, all of a sudden one day, we would come into a warehouse and there would be a civil defense fire engine, the Sage computer that had been deployed in northern Canada to defend us all against nuclear bombers coming over the poles from the Soviet Union. In front of that might be the PDP-8 computer, which was the first microcomputer, and then there would be an antique bicycle. Now, already what we're beginning to see out of this for me is like some kind of a surrealist installation. And what kind of readings are you going to make of this juxtaposition? We start looking into things. David had already started to take the plugs out of the Sage computer. There was these little plugs at the console where the operators who were watching the radars would basically sit. The nice thing about the console is it came with an ashtray and a cigarette lighter. And many of you probably already know that. We started taking out these little screw plugs that were there just to basically seal off areas where you could plug in other types of interface devices. And there was graffiti on the inside of these plugs. These operators had sat there with their pencils, and out of sheer boredom, or maybe they ran out of cigarettes, I don't know, they started to write little messages. It's howdy doody time. Welcome to Disneyland North. Help me get out of here. And I'm only telling you the polite ones. It's Dr. Strangelove. I mean, already we're in this narrative of the Cold War, the semi-automatic ground environment, all the things that I grew up with that, in essence, sort of instilled deep amounts of fear in our lives about what might happen in these events. And it is kind of all of a sudden reduced to these little plugs with these guys writing these little stories on the insides of these things. There was another day I was walking through the museum and I found these great boxes. They were Velveeta cheese boxes. And I thought, oh, there's going to be something really interesting and mysterious in this. And, you know, always hoping inductively that it would reveal something quite amazing. And so I took off the little cord and opened it up, and it was empty. And I thought, oh, well, this must be a really great artifact. Somebody's got it out for either a display or they're doing some research. So I closed it up, wrote down the artifact number, went back to the database to find out that, in fact, the Velveeta cheese box was the artifact. Now, that may sound incongruous to you too, but it's not. I think back to the Cold War. Yeah, I grew up with Velveeta cheese. It was always right next to the carton of Camel cigarettes that my father, the physician, would be smoking. This was the world we grew up in. This is the way in which these narratives begin to not just become the artifacts, but they become our narratives. We embody them ourselves. And this is something that I've learned from David. This is something that I think his talk tonight presents us, but it's also about the way in which we begin to understand that things speak. And when I think David tells his students, and I'm a bad student because I'm likely to go astray. I want to draw artistic meaning out of these things. So I'll make these things tell stories they would never want to tell. But just the same, we're still looking at the way in which we can build ideas and narratives around these stories. One of the other pictures I wanted to show you tonight, and it's only because we're in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, and I want to be quick, is the fact that the Bedeck hydrofoil is stored there. When I first got to Halifax in 1976, I used to see it in a shed in the harbor. And for those of you who don't know about the Bedeck, it was originally named the Bredor. It was built in the late 50s. It was a hydrofoil that was built for the Canadian fleet. It was tested but never deployed. It went from research and development directly into obsolescence. It's now in storage at the Canadian Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. I think we should repatriate this artifact. It might belong here, or maybe it belongs up in Bedeck next to the original hydrofoils that Graham Bell developed, which are now on display there. Anyway, I'd like to thank David, and I'd also like to thank you for your friendship and the collegiality that you've shown me at the museum. Thanks.
So I met David for the first time tonight. So I'm going to give a kind of off the wall view of what I'm seeing here, a kind of first impression. And one of the things that is great about a situation like that is that David does all the work and I get a chance to be reactionary. So that's partly what I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to sort of take the strength of the talk and maybe make a couple of points of my own. In a way, one of the ways I like to look at this is that we can think about David's talk and his research as a kind of artifact itself. So if we look at the talk, the artifacts he studied, let's unpack the analogy that I'm trying to make here. So if his talk is like an artifact, then he suggests that there is much to interpret and much to add. So I think we can all understand that about the talk and about the artifacts themselves. Let me put this another way. I'd like to say that David is giving voice to the artifact. And so this is another point I think he's making. Something that is mute now has a voice. He has coached speech out of these things. And so to put those two responses of mine together, the first step is like coaching speech out of artifacts is huge. Making technology articulate. And I was sort of looking for someone who could sort of put this in words. So I found this quote from Proust. So let me just bear with me a second here. In reality, as soon as each hour of one's life has died, it embodies itself in some material object, as do the souls of dead in certain folk stories, and hides there. And he goes on to say, there it remains captive forever, unless we happen upon the object, recognize what lies within, call it by its name, and so set it free. Which I think, in Proust's words, really kind of sums up what David's doing here. So I think David would also agree that there's much to add. The challenge, as I see it, might be summed up in one word. And the word for me is equivocal. And that is an interesting word because it sounds like it has positive roots, right? Equal, voice, this. And yet when we look at the way that people talk about equivocating, being equivocal, it's actually developed all these kind of negative meanings where you start to think about ambiguity and ambiguity as a negative. And so the ambiguous stories that in fact are being placed before us about these artifacts are interesting. And so one of the things that ambiguity I think has as a kind of question behind it and that the word equivocal captures is this idea about, is this ambiguity intentional? So this idea of being intentionally ambiguous as a way of obscuring is a really interesting issue, I think, for us to ponder about the work itself. I'm an architect, and so I teach students about artifacts. It's interesting, the kind of French word for buildings is immeuble, which is really, translates into immovables. And so we don't have the kind of provenance issues that immobile artifacts have, mobile artifacts have. But there are some issues, I think, that a couple of examples from our field would illuminate. So I could show you some slides here too, but I don't have the slides. But for those of you who might know, there is a kind of interesting set of technologies in architecture. One kind of iconic building in architecture is the Crystal Palace, which was the first major exhibition building in 1851 in Britain. And it has many, many contexts. For architects, it was always the kind of supreme technological object, the object that actually changes the way that buildings are built. All of a sudden, glass greenhouses become a way to house buildings, glass architecture. And so that story is always there, and yet when one looks at the object closely, the building itself is not an advanced technological object. It's actually made of wood. It appears to be made of cast iron, but it's made of wood. The glass is actually very low-key. It is actually very simple glass that's put together in this rather ramshackle way. And in fact, the person I studied with actually believed it failed structurally, and that in the process of failing, the whole structure jammed in place. So it's a kind of building that stood up despite itself, despite its new technologies. So that's an interesting artifact, and yet there have been two renovations of that theory, of the kind of, one is to honor the technology of the building. And it turns out that if we can reconsider the building as a building that is in fact one of the first organizations of the building site. The act of building this building in 9 months or whatever it took to build these buildings, and the reach of this building back into the factories of England was tremendous, and the reorganization of building sites. So that story of that building has been reinvested with this kind of technological meaning. But here's where the ambiguity comes in. Because recently, about 10, 15 years ago, a new story emerges about this building. And it's a building that now is talked about in a new set of ways, where in fact it becomes one of the first shopping malls. That in fact the exotica from around the world gets placed in this building, gets put in Hyde Park. The glass becomes a way of placing commodities within nature and introducing consumerism to us all. So I raise that as one example, and I have another example of this idea of ambiguity placed in objects that I think David is actually starting to talk about. And probably a related issue, a related example is the Maison de Verre, which is a house in Paris built in 1928. And this Maison de Verre has been known as basically it's an incredibly strong building that in a way is the first domestic instance of industrial design being used as a house. In other words, there's an industrial designer who builds this fabulous house. It's called Maison de Verre because in fact it's made of glass in all its versions, some of it translucent. And it becomes an object of reverence. It actually becomes very influential to the British high-tech architects of the late 1980s. And so it's kind of influence on high-tech architecture in all its glory. In that story, it's a simple doctor's house. But 10 years later, the story adds ambiguity. Because it turns out that it becomes all the more charged. Because it's not just a doctor's house, it's a doctor's clinic. And the doctor is a gynecologist. And so the issue of glass becomes charged with Michel Foucault, the gaze, the new panopticon. So you can see that this kind of ambiguity that's introduced into this house becomes an interesting aspect. So I raised these two examples to talk about, asking a kind of question about, were these standard interpretations ambiguous? Were they equivocations? Did they intend to mislead? Perhaps on this 100th anniversary of Women's Day, we might be tempted to say yes. Right? And as David has shown us, objects have many stories. He has recognized what lies within, called it by its name, and so set it free. It remains for us to be comfortable with these new voices, perhaps a parliament of things, many stories that might not add up to a whole. And so thank you, David, for these stories.
Thank you very much, Ted, Bob, and David. I actually will ask you to come up here. It's now time for questions and answers. And I ask David Richardson from the Nova Scotian Institute of Science to chair the Q&A session.
To turn to tonight's talk, I'll maybe start off with a quick question which somebody might follow up. And with David, he mentioned everything, but the thing that intrigued me is how on earth did Hertzberg get the funding to load that equipment and get it over to Canada? And, that is another story that you didn't touch on. Do you have the answer?
Yeah, I actually meant to mention that. One of the issues with these types of objects, provenance issue, is ownership. So I actually don't know really who owns that object. Obviously, the physics department at the University of Saskatchewan does, and I'm not going to raise too much of a stink about that, but I think it's an example of an object that if you really looked into it carefully, you'd be there would be some uncertainty about who actually owns it. For example, the Carnegie Foundation actually funded Hertzberg to come there. That was the breakthrough in the mid-30s.
But how did he get the permission from the Nazis to...
Okay, so there's the other thing. That precision part came obviously from the workshop in Darmstadt. The bigger part of it was made by the instrument makers that summer as he was journeying across the Atlantic and through the United States. So the core kind of precision part came from Darmstadt. As far as I could see, the money came from Carnegie, and then the bigger parts, like the cast iron frame, was made locally. I think it's a really interesting potential reversal of Nazi provenance, because you have potentially Darmstadt wanting that back. Now, when I look into provenance, I am not afraid of the consequences, and I think that would be a really interesting consequence. And I told the chair of the physics department there that would be a really fun collaboration if they wanted to get together with Darmstadt on that issue. So I think, I don't think they should give it up, but it is a really, the actual ownership of it, when you look at these objects, we don't often know who owns it. So that is a good question.
That's one question. If anybody else has another question or comment, please do use the microphone or hold up your hand.
I was wondering, you mentioned that there are these sort of heroic myths. You said science guards its myths and heroic narratives. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the kind of meta-narratives around science itself, right? Because it does seem we get these dichotomous narratives, science as savior, science as sort of villain, and then the kinds of equivocations that were being talked about here seems maybe to fall back into that glorification versus demonization as being the kind of meta-narrative that keeps on being wound into these individual narratives and separate artifacts. And I wonder if that isn't also kind of a problem, right? That sort of takes away the features of ordinariness to scientific artifacts, which, is set like any other technological artifact, like food. It's kind of ordinary. It's wrapped into a whole bunch of narratives, and you can glorify the farmer or you can demonize his exploitation of the farm work or whatever. So is there that kind of I don't know, almost Zoroastrian kind of narrative. Zoroastrian, evil, good and evil, the sort of fight between good and evil instantiated in these two kind of meta-narratives about science that, I don't know, infects the kinds of narratives you're giving. Maybe this is a bit of a criticism, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think in terms of, let's just talk about one aspect of your question, the heroic aspect and science protecting its myths, and how I see that on frontline museum work. Let me just say that that's different than the history of science. History of science has, I think, very successfully in the past 40 years been dismantling that kind of tradition. But we don't see that in the museum of science world. And it's, there's a lot of reasons for that, because one thing I'm saying here is that we are frontline. We are collecting from, we are often dependent on these pockets these little tribal pockets of people who are saving these things, and what is saved becomes the history. And also there's a lot of different agendas at a museum. There's a lot of different partners, contemporary science, industrial partners, and they're not influencing us in any particular way. I'm not presenting it in that way, but you often, there's just traditions within Science Museum that we haven't been able to do what the history of science has been doing in that regard. So we often, just by the nature of our collections, it just becomes this self-fulfilling kind of more gravitates towards the celebratory aspects. So I think that's, a major part of the answer. But the other thing is, what I really like about the Provenance is that it really does liberate you from those narratives, and it really does do. I think that's what I'm saying tonight, is that I think the secret you're behind changing this is actually taking Provenance seriously, and kind of doing what we should be doing, and that is showing that science isn't separate from society, but that it is part of it. So often with a spectrograph, the habit or the tradition is to present it, how does it work? And it was part of an innovation in the study of light. I'm more interested in how society works, and that's why the Darmstadt plaque is really interesting to me, and that's what Provenance can do. So that's a kind of one aspect of your question.
Any other questions?
So what is the role of a science museum? We have the Ontario Science Centre, which considers itself a science museum, and it's really for training people to go to casinos, right? And smash things and have lights and everything go like that. So what do you think is the role of a national museum? To tell our story of the history of Canada and its relationship with technology, or to serve a public service or a research service? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I'd like to hear Bob on this too, because he spent a lot of time in our museum and has, obviously, as an outsider, has a fresh perspective. I think let's just say, a very practical answer to your question. When I came to the museum, I was skeptical of some of the national narratives. There's a artificiality to it, in a sense, and you see this in a lot of the national science museums around the world, and I think some people have issues with that. The Deutsches Museum, or even the Smithsonian, or the Science Museum in London. There's national narratives, and people are uncomfortable with that. But what I really like about that in our museum, actually, is that in the history of science and in history, people often don't even know about Gerhard Hertzberg. And so that one aspect of our public service is that one historian of science, for example, told me that when he was choosing a topic, he just went down through our Hall of Fame and actually got some of his inspiration for a topic from that. And that to me is interesting. So in that sense, we're promoting through the Summer Institute, through our collection research, research that would not be done otherwise. That a lot of graduate students, as you know, in the history of science often do continental history of science, like I did actually, stuff on France, but with a Canadian story. A lot of American history of science, and they don't even know that there's resources and really interesting stories in Canada. So that's like a major part of what our collection and research that we do. I think we're really supporting that, and we have a whole collection development policy that is geared towards all the different areas of our collection, and we have experts from the history of science, history of technology, actually write on the history of meteorology in Canada that help us guide in the collection. On another practical level, we preserve the material heritage of these areas in the country. That's really important. We have a representative collection of these different areas in the history of science and technology, and if you believe in the power of artifacts for telling these stories, like I do, that's really important. One thing that I'm shifting in my role is, as you saw this afternoon, I'm actually going out to the regions and helping facilitate the development of these collections in the regions. So I'm not a traditional curator. I will want to take a few things from Saskatoon, from here, but I really want these regional collections to to actually develop with a voice and with expertise in that area, so that people can benefit it and the public can benefit from these artifacts in the area. So that's one thing I see as a shift in my position. But Bob may want to speak about how he sees our museum.
Maybe just to reiterate some of the things that David said, and I think for many people who have been here or spent time in Ottawa and you have been around the national museums and the clusters there, you know they function under mandates, and sometimes those mandates may get in the way of other kinds of stories that can be told, or those stories get told in other contexts. The symposiums, there was a really interesting international conference while I was there just called Artifacts. It brought in scholars from all over the world, but it was only attended by other scholars. So the question is, how do you make these other narratives, these other stories, or these histories of science available maybe to those herds of screaming children who are there every day? And I don't mean to say that in a negative way, but there would be days where I would leave the museum and it would just be a roar. It would be great. I think, oh, this is great, this is alive. And I would go to the National Gallery and you could hear a pin drop. It's like going from someplace where people are really living their lives to someplace where everything just feels like a tomb. It's kind of like dead. It's the difference between moving between an active space and a contemplative space. But how you mediate that, I don't know. And maybe you do that by inviting different types of groups in to work with your artifacts, or in some cases it may just be giving the curators the opportunity to say what they really want to say. And I think that would in fact open it up a little bit more too, that just open up the constraints of the mandates a little bit more and allow for more experimentation in the kinds of displays that the artifacts are allowed to bring. And this will go back to a little bit about what Ted's final comment about the Parliament of Things and the agency that we give to things, and let's let those things speak. And we can maybe sometimes take off the flag and take off the need to continually develop ideas of Canada as a place for investing in industry and technology, and look at some of these other stories that do need to be told.
Any other questions? Well, if there are no other direct questions, hopefully you'll come enjoy the snacks afterwards, and also give you an opportunity to talk on a more informal level. But before we do that, I'd like to thank our speakers. In particular, I think I'd like to thank David for really focusing and bringing to us a new concept of what provenance has to play in terms of scientific instruments of the type that he's talked about. And also thank our other speakers for their contributions, and the audience and our speakers for answering the questions. Hopefully you'll go home a little bit wiser and have enjoyed this evening as I have. Let's join together and thank the speakers.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.